All right, well, it looks like we have everybody in. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Anne Marie Murphy, and on behalf of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia, the Center for Foreign Policy Studies at Seton Hall, and the New York Southeast Asian Network, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on Vietnamese foreign policy towards the United States. This evening's talk is part of a virtual conference series entitled Southeast Asia Views America, Perceptions, Policies, and Prospects. And the seminar series aims to assess the tenor of Southeast Asian US relations as the Biden administration begins its efforts to engage regional allies and partners. And Vietnam is, of course, one of Washington's key partners in Southeast Asia, and how Vietnam views the United States and the prospects that our leading analysts here tonight believe might be held for US-Vietnamese relations is the topic of our discussion. We're extremely fortunate to have three leading experts in the field with us here tonight, and I'd like to introduce them now. Our main presenter tonight will be Dr. Huong Le Thu. She is the senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's Defence and Strategy Program. She previously worked at the Cora Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, and the Institute of International Relations in Taiwan. She therefore brings a wide range of experience and interests to this talk tonight. And we are extremely happy to have not just one, but two discussants here with us today. Dr. Liang Hong Nguyen is the Dorothy Borg Associate Professor in History of the United States and East Asia. She specializes in the Vietnam War, US-Southeast Asia relations, and the Cold War. And under her leadership, I'm delighted to announce that Columbia has just launched a new Vietnamese studies program and is in the process of forging new partnerships between Columbia and universities in Vietnam. And last but certainly not least, we have Murray Hebert, who is a senior associate in the Southeast Asia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. He earlier served as senior advisor and deputy director of the Southeast Asia program. And prior to joining CSIS, he was the Senior Director for Southeast Asia at the US Chamber of Commerce and a longtime journalist in Beijing and other places. So the way we're going to proceed today is that Dr. Le Thu will make her presentation entitled Internal Pull, External Push, Domestic and International Factors Driving Vietnamese-US Relations. After that, I'll invite Dr. Nguyen and Murray Hebert to make some comments before opening it up to the audience for Q&A. I will let you know that the Q&A function is open, so if you have questions, please do insert them there. And please identify yourself as you do so. So without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to turn the floor or the screen over to Dr. Le Thu. Please.
Thank you, Terry. And first, I'd like to start with appreciation and thank you for inviting me to this very exciting project. I'm delighted to be a part of it, and I'm even more delighted to be speaking and sharing the webinar with my very favorite people in the field. So I'm very excited this morning. I'll be starting with Vietnam in this bigger project. So I thought I'll start a little bit with the regional context to place Vietnam in Southeast Asia and also, in a broader Indo-Pacific context, since Vietnam has been mentioned by the previous administration under Trump and also in the initial days of Biden administration as one of key actors in the Indo-Pacific. So let me just show you one thing before I get to start into details. I wanted to show you this visual. You can see my screen? Okay.
Yes.
So I've been studying the alignments in Southeast Asia for a while, and one of the very inspiring books was John Church's in 2015, where he placed Vietnam somewhere in between. This is a sort of neutral line, And between US and China, obviously the environment back then was very different than it is now. But Vietnam was in the mid 2010s was seen as really keeping the equidistance between the major powers, with a little bit leaning towards US with a tendency, but you can see that the traditional US partners and allies, Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia are on this side, whereas Vietnam is smack in between. Now, the recent book I've read, and obviously the two authors apply very different measures and their categories in how they place countries in Southeast Asia in particular, very differently. But you know, just for a comparison, I quote the recent book by David Shamble that was just published early this year, where Great Power Meet in Southeast Asia. And David Shamble put Vietnam the closest to the US among all Southeast Asian countries. That was a very interesting comparison for me. And it shows you how in this, you know, not that long time, a period, things have changed in the region, and how the alignment and the views of the Southeast Asian partners have changed and kind of shift during this time. Obviously, like I said, the environment is very different in the past few years, but it shows you also, you know, the changes that have occurred among other partners. Now, I'm not sure if I could agree in totality with David Shamble about that Vietnam is the closest to US, even more than Singapore was a traditionally very important security actor. I suppose it depends what we are talking about. But I think there are a number of other studies that may confirm some sort of alignment of views that Vietnam now shares with US. And that includes the views on the Indo-Pacific as a region, that includes the shared perception of China's threat, and a number of other issues that I will dig in a little bit more. But I also wanted to show you one more visual before, can you see? Well, this is a little bit small, but I'm quoting this Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, ISIS Institute, where I used to work before, now annual survey of elite perceptions in the region. And in the past 3 years that the survey has been going, Vietnam's elite perspective, elite attitudes towards the US has been also standing out from the crowd of other Southeast Asian respondents. It's always shows, even under Trump years, a couple of years back, that Vietnam was always the most supportive of US and had the most positive views on US. And I quote here, for example, the confidence in US doing the right thing, you know, whether they contribute to global peace, security, prosperity, and governance. You might not see it, but it is, you know, comparatively to all countries, Vietnam responded were the most confident in US role. Similarly, you know, in terms of how US, you know, confidence in US leadership and maintain global international law, again, Vietnamese responded were the most confident in the US. And of course, when in the question about, you know, if you had to choose, if your country, the region had to make choice between the US and China, who would you choose? And obviously, Vietnam was very strongly leaning towards US. And that also, I quote, here is a response from 2020, from earlier on, which the survey had been done under Trump administration before Biden took office. Vietnam's confidence was also quite surprising. Philippines was also quite positive, but you know, it was quite surprising how confident Vietnamese respondents were feeling towards the US. And similarly, the other studies, whether it's Pew Research Center, the Global Perception Studies, or my own surveys that I've done about other issues, including the Quad and other regional order issues, have always confirmed that positive attitude that the Vietnamese public have had towards the US. So I think it's rather constant. It might have been a little bit shaken after the COVID and perhaps recent events in DC, but we'll get to that in a minute. So just let me get back to the really core of bilateral relations. So we know that in terms of regional context, Vietnam is quite strongly and positively viewing the US. But in terms of bilateral relations, I think this relationship is really special. Now, every relationship is special, but I think because of historic relationship and context, this one is more special in many ways. The pace and the changes that will happen, it's always going to be determined by those historical contexts in many ways, especially now that we have, we still have in Vietnam the leadership that some of them still remembers that war era. Now, I wanted to talk about the legacy a little bit, because that had determined the pace of particularly security and defense cooperation. For a long time after normalization, I think the security aspect of relationship would be the one that is taking the most time, because both sides needed to nurture the trust, and that was something that needed time and needed constant reassurance. We have reassurance from the US as recent as 2010, 2013, during when the two countries signed a comprehensive partnership, and the US had to reassure Vietnam that it respects its political system. I think that was become customary for the two countries in the dialogue and in the bilateral dialogue. So that was still, Vietnam still needed that reassurance from the US. There was still lingering, issues whether US would harbor any peaceful evolution kind of ambitions there still. So the security cooperation aspect took a long time. It was very gradual. It was focused on humanitarian assistance and issues like military medicine or search and rescue, and of course addressing war legacy. But more concrete cooperation had to be gradual until last few years. I think under Trump administration, the security cooperation between US and Vietnam really speeded up. And Vietnam passed the Trump test, as I showed you in the regional context, because the relationship actually blossomed during the Trump administration, despite the fact that US has suffered from a lot of criticism in terms of how it dealt with allies and partners, not only in Southeast Asia, but also throughout the Indo-Pacific and even Europe. Nevertheless, the relationship with Vietnam, I think I assess is quite positive in terms of how it developed. There are some issues which I will get into in a minute, but I think in general it was very positive and speeded up, including the security cooperation. Now, the Vietnamese were very proactive. Prime Minister Nguyen Phu was the first one to arrive to Trump's Washington, first of Southeast Asian leader to arrive in Washington. Only the third leader, and I think it was a proactive attempt to, first of all, keep Trump's attention, because back then there was a concern that Trump was only, focused on North Korea or China trade issues. So it was an attempt to, remind him of Southeast Asia, of South China Sea, but also, reassure that issue that Trump cared about, which is trade and trade imbalance. President Trump visited Vietnam in his first year of presidency, which is very rare for a US president. We didn't have that for many decades. When he attended Vietnam hosted APEC summit in 2017, and that was one of his last visit in the region in terms of later attending multilateral fora. And then 2 years later, Vietnam hosted the second Trump-Kim summit. So I think that was the only country that Trump visited twice, and only Southeast Asian country that Trump visited twice, I guess, or only two, among two, I think Singapore as well. In any case, there were very many visits from high-level representation from the US. Some of them related to the preparation to Trump-Kim summit, of course. Secretary Pompeo made visits before. We had several visits from Secretary of Defense, first Mattis and then Esper. We had a number of visits from Indo-PACOM commander. We had 2 aircraft carriers visits to the region. A lot of the exchanges there, and when US disinvited China to the RIMPAC exercises, it also invited Vietnam. So, you know, there are a lot of examples I can quote that in that security relationship really speeded up at that time. And that points to, you know, what I call the angles of alignment between US and Vietnam. And those focus around China, the views on China as a threat, a security threat to the region, mostly in the case for Vietnam, particularly in case of the South China Sea, the ongoing and continuous harassments. And Vietnam was very appreciative that US was very much willing to call out all those coercive examples, whether when the Chinese sunk Vietnamese boats or prevented the Vietnamese from exploration of their own natural resources within their own exclusive economic zone, or a very important development, which was the State Department's statement on the 13th of July 2020, when US change had a new position on the South China Sea, which explicitly denied China's historical rights. It made references to the UNCLOS, to the 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling, but also in many times, in many occasions, have supported Vietnam either in its rights or pointed the case of Chinese coercion towards Vietnam as something unacceptable and against the international rule of law. Another thing I think is Vietnam has featured quite prominently in US Indo-Pacific strategy. I call it a sort of US rediscovered Vietnam. And in, like I said, President Trump in 2017 made a speech in Da Nang, which is the first time he mentioned Indo-Pacific. Later on, as the administration developed the strategy, whether it was national defense strategy or national security strategy, Vietnam did feature in it quite as one of the key actors in the Indo-Pacific. So there was this, you know, both recognition from US of the importance of Vietnam, but also from my study, Vietnam was also quite positive towards the Indo-Pacific strategy, certainly in comparison to other Southeast Asian neighbors. One thing I thought was quite positive and is positive is the attention to Mekong as well, because under Obama administration, the US had the Lower Mekong Initiative, but it didn't do much. It wasn't very well resourced, and it sort of went into lethargy for a while. But towards the end of Trump administration and also under Biden administration, as so far, I think there's a return to Mekong focus, especially supporting the Lower Mekong countries. And the Lower Mekong Initiative has been now rebranded as a Mekong US Partnership. And I am quite hopeful that this will be a positive contribution that US has for the region, and that would particularly benefit Vietnam, which is at the very low end of the estuary and have a lot of suffers a lot of effect of dams upstream as well as the climate issues. Now, I think with the Biden administration, it's a little bit too early to say. We're close to the 100 days. There hasn't been much of Southeast Asia that features so far, other than Vietnam's featuring in the interim security guideline, and I think the very recent one, the Strategic Competition Act that just came out. Vietnam again features quite prominently, which would suggest that the Biden administration will continue the line of the Indo-Pacific strategy, as well as competition with China, which is even in the name. I hope that the climate focus of the Biden administration will be quite beneficial for Vietnam because Vietnam was one of the few actors from Southeast Asia that had been invited to the upcoming summit. Now, not only US has changed leadership, Vietnam has also changed leadership. And I would like to talk a little bit now about how that would change Vietnamese attitude towards the next couple of years. So Vietnam's had 1 in 5 years of the 13-party Congress earlier this year, and between late January and February, in which it re-elected for the third term Secretary General Nguyen Phu Trong. Now, Nguyen Phu Trong has been, as I said, already playing 2 terms. He had visited Washington before in 2013 to sign that comprehensive partnership. He was due to go again, and there was speculation about upgrading the partnership to strategic partnership, but he had been of ill health, so the visit didn't come to fruition. But what has changed in the current Vietnamese leadership is now that we also have new cabinet as of a couple of weeks. So the Prime Minister Nguyen Phu, who had been quite active and met President Trump and had been into America several times, is now allocated a position of president, the state president. We have new Prime Minister Phạm Minh Chính, and new defense minister, new foreign minister, new trade minister. So those who are at the working levels are all new. Before we had in foreign minister's leadership of Phạm Minh Minh, who had been in the position for 10 years and who is known for being quite pro-Western, or at least that was his kind of reputation. Now, this Politburo that had been elected by the 13-party Congress, to me, looks quite traditional. There is an outnumber of people who have public security background. Some of them are quite, have a traditionalist background, such as like Chap, who is known to be, the theoretician of Marxist-Leninist theories, had been educated in that era. Phạm Minh Chính, the prime minister, has been also educated in Bucharest. So there is quite emphasis on the more traditional line. There's a clear ambition to continue the anti-corruption campaign, and the public security portfolio, or heavy public security and military representation in the Central Committee, might suggest to me that there would be more focus on domestic security, and potentially, if anyone still harbors that distrust that I've mentioned earlier in the presentation, it is probably more, probably more likelihood that we will find them in this current representation. Having said that, though, the 13-party Congress also came up with, obviously, new plans and new plans of next 5 years, and all the leaders have voted to continue the current line of foreign policy, which means multilateralization, the foreign policy based on expanding partnerships and friendship, non-reliance, and very much continuing its current form. But I do think, having said that, though, I think every Vietnam's policy, because of its one-party state and its nature, is not going to be extremely different. The changes in the personnel don't often mean absolute big changes, like, for example, in the case of Philippines or even US in the democratically elected governments. But having said that, though, I think the personality of prime ministers and cabinet do matter. You remember Prime Minister Nguyễn Tấn Dũng before Nguyen Phu, and they are diametrically different. They really represented Vietnam's interest in a rather different way, and they did steer the country in a little bit different way. Now, I think a few concerns about what could go wrong if go ahead. I think, like I outlined, Biden administration is likely to still see Vietnam as an important security actor in the region, and Vietnam will also continue in the same line. Now, where could be potential areas of friction? First of all, Biden administration as a democratic administration is more expected to be more value-oriented foreign policy, emphasis on human rights and democratic values, and it did say that it will prioritize human rights. So that could potentially be an issue, given, like I said, Vietnamese government is also willing to, it's also planning on continuing anti-corruption campaign. We've had, prominent arrest of journalists just before the party congress, but also there's an issue of, something that started under Trump, which is deportation of Vietnam War era refugees from US. And I think one of the recent news I saw was very late March, which is, already under Biden. So that also could be an issue. The anti-Asian violence could become also, a friction that might change some of the public perception of the America. And I think in a long term, and of course, there's ongoing issues of trade dispute. Vietnam's trade imbalance. US is Vietnam's biggest export market, and US suffers trade deficit with Vietnam. When it became an issue under Trump in 2016, I think it was the deficit that US suffered was around 32 billion. Now it is, as of last year, it's around 70 billion. So it's actually, skyrocketed in a way. So it's becoming more of a problem than less so. And last year, just at tail end of the last year, Vietnam was labeled a currency manipulator. There was investigation. I think there's a new report coming from US Treasury today, and it's likely, probably I haven't seen it, but probably that is still an issue, and that is also not very well received from Vietnam, especially that the labeling doesn't change much. It's actually just doing more damage than makes force Vietnam into better financial and currency management. And I would say that there is, having said that, so there's no coordination between economic and commercial interests and the national security interest. It says there's a gap. It seems that there is a gap there. The national security interest of the US says that Vietnam is very important, and actually, if anything, on that side is the challenge of over-promising and imagining too much expectations over there, because we've heard that comments that Vietnam might be joining Quad Plus if or expectations such, or even the comments that the Pentagon would want to have a base in Vietnam. So there is a risk of over imagining and over promising what this particular what this set of relationship can lead us now as of now. And I think in the long term, it is quite a vulnerable position for Vietnam and US, because under Trump, even though the relationship, like I said, really speeded up and blossomed, I think they lost a little bit of the specialness of the relationship. It become quite utilitarian, in my view, and that's probably it's good for now. But imagining, the position that US is doing its approach either or. So this invite China from the Ring Pact, but invite Vietnam, puts that in the context of it's either or. What if in one day the scenario that US and China will repair their relationship? Where does it put Vietnam? Let's say, right? Like, so I think in the long term there is lack of that strong basis that the two relationships can be strong on their own, rather than just because of the external push, which is China. Bearing in mind that the two countries are not aligned on everything, they're not aligned on many other things. And even though there are many positivities, and I'll end up on that to give sufficient time to my co-presenters. For example, a lot of American companies want to relocate to Vietnam as a result of competition with China or boycotting China, or especially in the tech sector because of the Huawei and other Chinese tech companies ban and blacklist. Vietnam is a very good alternative market, or anchor factory position and whatnot. But I think in the longer term, there will be challenges, including, for example, disagreement between norms and rules and principles. And as an example, I will give you the new cyber security law that Vietnam has passed, in which it provides the state access to the data. It requires the data to be stored in Vietnam, and the companies will have to make the data available for the government and state agencies. So there will be divergences in terms of norms, principles, and rules, and because US is not. And another thing that relates to the norms and rules is the lack of US participation in TPP, which is now CPTPP. So it's lack of economic pillar, lack of a channel to promote those rules and norms. And also another example is, I don't think it's probably feasible to accept from Biden administration as of now to also ratify UNCLOS, which is another example of friction in terms of rules and norms and laws, because that's what Vietnam probably would welcome. I'll probably run out of the time, so I'm happy to stop here, and we can come back to some of the issues I've raised in the discussion part. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that, Huong. That was so comprehensive, from the international down to the domestic. You covered so many issues. I found that fascinating. At this time, Heng, would you like to jump in with a few comments?
Sure. Dr. Le Thu, that was amazing. I learned a lot as I was as before we opened up the webinar, I was thinking about myself as a historian, and not someone who follows contemporary affairs, how I would see this sort of period right now as a transition, and sort of the articles, the webinars that I would use if I were a historian who could actually write 50 years from now. This would definitely be one of the talks that I think will eventually, it will set the tone, the issues going forward in terms of where U.S.-Vietnamese relations are right now between Trump and Biden. You know, as Anne Marie said, I think, you know, you've really covered a huge amount of ground in what you put forward for us today and for us to think about. Again, as a historian, you know, I have so many questions about, and here I'll focus my first set of comments on the Politburo and on the top level leadership. You know, again, in the period that I looked at in the 1960s and 70s, it was, I think, much simpler than what's going on today. And through your work, through Alex Moving, Từng Vu, all of these folks, Home Hip in Singapore, doing so much work sort of categorizing the different forces there in the party leadership, rent seekers, reformers, conservatives. If I could ask you to, you know, sort of expand on that bit more with the recent 13th Party Congress, and particularly those who rose to prominence. In addition, if you could see if there are new labels, if there are new categories we should come up with, I would love to hear your thoughts on that. And if you could also speak on the sort of regional frictions at play in the recent party Congress. Was there a region that lost out in terms of representation in the Central Committee and in the top party leadership? Again, this is from my vantage point as a historian, where you had, you know, it boiled down a lot to regionalism. It did boil down to foreign policy, it boiled down to ideology, many things. But I'd love to pick your brain further about the top party leadership and where you would place key individuals. Connected to that, you know, the interesting thing about Nguyen Phu Trong, again, in my very as not someone who is an expert weighing in on Nguyen Phu Trong, I did a presentation recently in which, you know, I was saying he's you know, even though people have, you know, given that he's in this unprecedented third term, he isn't Lê Duẩn. You don't have someone who's monopolizing power. Was he a compromise candidate in the sense that he was able to serve a third term, not because he dominated, you know, the debates before the 13th Party Congress, ones that we will never know because this is the most closed period before Party Congress. No leaking of secrets, of gossip, or even publication of open letters. So we didn't see the sort of negotiating behind closed doors that we had seen in Party Congresses in the past. What do you think of that? What does that mean? What does it mean that he's emerged for this third term with this sort of, okay, you know, you're over 65, way over 65, but you know, you're going to have a pass. What does this all mean in terms of how do we understand who, you know, Nguyen Phu Trong is between the spectrum of various, you know, general secretary leaders who we've seen in Vietnam's modern past. So in that sense, so you know, is the 13th Party Congress the 5th Party Congress, right before 1986, and the last grasp of Lê Duẩn, you know, basically leadership over the Politburo and the party before Đổi Mới of 1986? Or are we seeing something like, you know, 1960, in which this was already a few years after Lê Duẩn acted as, you know, acting general secretary, and then, you know, came to the fore during the third party Congress to say, I'm, you know, no, I am general secretary, and then of course stays in that position until 1986. Now, obviously, Nguyen Phu Trong isn't going to live that long, and even, you know, Lê Duẩn didn't hold on to extreme power all the way to his death in 1986. But are we seeing the beginning of some sort of legacy in which Nguyen Phu Trong can continue even past his time as general secretary? So just the interest in, where do you see Nguyen Phu Trong? Is he some sort of compromise candidate? Is he a Lê Duẩn? Is he a Xi Jinping, which I don't think he is, but in terms of how do we you know, sort of understand Nguyen Phu Trong and his position as general secretary, his yeah. So that's, I had all these other questions. I think you answered most of them. I had this I wanted you to discuss the angles of misalignment, which you did at the end in sort of drawing out where you see the trouble areas where the United States and Vietnam may not agree. And if I could ask you more in terms of, when you discussed human rights as a potential thorn again, because it was not one under Trump. Trump did not value human rights. And so that wasn't put there on the table in terms of U.S.-Vietnam relations. And it really was about trade. It was about, towards the end, in terms of negative issues, it was about currency manipulation. I wanted to ask about the role of sort of grassroots organizations. So you spoke a lot about the party leadership. What role do you see aside from, well, so if I could connect this to your presentation, it's really that second slide. So if we were to reach beyond the party leadership, and if you talk to the Vietnamese people, what would it look like now in terms of how they foresee the Biden administration, and do they miss this sense of this idea of the strongman Trump who stands up to China, and that Biden is I think I've read something, maybe it was from David Brown, that it's stupid Joe or something like that he doesn't have this sort of forceful personality in Vietnam that Trump had. Where do you see the role of, and again, I know that we can't generalize about Vietnamese public opinion, but what do they have in terms of influence over what the party leadership can do in terms of forming or trying to forge a closer bond to the United States? Do everyday Vietnamese miss Trump for whatever reasons they have? Because if these polls are true, in 2020, and we know this is one of the issues that actually aligned the diasporic community, particularly Vietnamese American community, and the public opinion in Vietnam, and that is there was much support for Trump. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about these sort of grassroots organizations, grassroots demonstrations, how they play out in terms of the future of how Vietnam and Vietnamese see the United States. So again, Murray is, I bow to him. I'm glad he's gonna have more questions for you. So I think I'll stop there because I'm also very keen on hearing Murray's comments, and I look forward to hearing your responses. But what you put forward tonight for me has been invaluable as a historian and naive follower of current Vietnamese politics. So thank you so much, Huong.
Murray, would you like to give your comments now?
Sure. Thanks, Anne-Marie, for inviting us, and thanks, Huong, for your presentation, and Leon for your comments. The women on this panel have already carried the ball across the goal line, so there's not much to say, but I'll just make a few sort of smallish comments on what Huong talked about. I know you didn't write David Shambao's book, but what I would do, that where he has Vietnam closer to the US than Singapore is just not right. Singapore has bases where Americans can land airplanes and land boats. They have a bilateral trade agreement with the United States. And Vietnam has none of those. And so it's not really fair, I don't think, but I tried to, these things change. I tried to do one of those too in my book recently.
And by the way, his book is great. We did a book talk on it. It's on the New York Southeast Asian Network website for anybody who would like to do it. Sorry, Murray, just wanted to give you a plug.
Thank you. It may be just a way I understood what you were saying, but I'd have a little quibble with you said that, I think you described relations with Trump being sort of as good as they ever were. They were very good in the security space. On trade space, they were non-existent or negative. They didn't, US only nagged at them. They sent USTR over to Vietnam to nag them on everything, and then did not in the end do a trade agreement. Yeah, that's makes that point. On the Mekong, I agree with you. That's an important issue, but that also began under Trump. I hate to laud Trump on stuff, but sometimes he did the right stuff. And Pompeo is really the one that raised the Mekong and China's threats through its 11 dams and through its dams it's building in Laos and Cambodia, and the threats to the Mekong, Vietnam's Mekong Delta. It started under Pompeo, and really we haven't seen the Biden guys talk about the Mekong yet, that I've seen at least. It's interesting. You mentioned that Vietnam's been invited to the climate change conference that Biden is hosting later this month. I think it's the 22nd and 23rd or something. But Vietnam has not yet confirmed that it's going to show up, which is very interesting. I don't know that if that's because what the reason for that is. Only Singapore and Indonesia have confirmed from Southeast Asia. Is it that Prime Minister Ching, who should probably come, he's been in office by then, maybe 3 or 4 weeks, is not really very confident in handling that situation. I don't know what the issue is, but so they may come in at the last minute too. That's possible. One small correction: Trump visited U.S. in 2015, not in 2013. That's, I think, the same year they signed the strategic agreement. So it's 2 years later. So yeah, on trade, it'll be really interesting what Vietnam, what Vietnam and what the U.S. actually does, and what Vietnam can agree to. We've had Thai, the U.S. trade representative. She's only been in the saddle about 3 weeks. And so far, the administration is still planning what it's still strategizing what it's going to do. We don't have any idea, but privately, mid-level officials say that one of the things they're looking at is doing mini bilaterals or mini multilaterals that would include maybe a digital trade agreement, the one they're negotiating with Japan and with Singapore. Now, I hope Vietnam would be able to do that, or environmental goods and services. That's the other option they're considering. I haven't heard Vietnam, comment on that. It's actually not public. And on the question of whether the Pentagon wants a base in Vietnam, of course, Vietnam is perfect, and they know it. But there was a story, I don't know if you saw it in Australia, a little story about in the gray zone this week in Washington. That piece was, I don't know how it was sourced. I couldn't tell. As a former journalist, that would not have made the past muster. Your editor said, who are you relying on? But I talked to a couple of defense people after that to see, and they said, oh yeah, sure, you could have one guy going off and telling the Vietnamese who want to do this, but nobody from Mattis on down didn't realize the hardship that would impose on Vietnam. So that it is an issue. It comes up constantly because Vietnam will hold the US off on ship visits and that kind of thing. But I really don't think they'll go to the mat on that issue at all. Yeah, I think those are the main issues. I thought it was a good, comprehensive overview. And Vietnam, like you said, is clearly a leader in the region, and the U.S. views it that way, except in the case now of Myanmar, where Vietnam sent a general to attend Army Day on March 27th. With China and Russia, and the U.S. has been putting a lot of pressure, nudging, cajoling ASEAN to do something about Myanmar. And the only people that are raising their hands are I guess Indonesia has the highest raised hand. Singapore has maybe the next highest raised hand, and the Philippines is also a player. But Vietnam has not done anything, which, I guess that might get noticed in the democracy and human rights debate in this town. And if I can just take on Leanne's question about Trump, I think he was a compromise candidate. I don't know if Huong and I did debate this at one point, but I don't remember what we said. But, because there were other candidates put forward and they didn't get the majority. And there's also talk that former Prime Minister Phu was put his hand up and had some support, but that Trump blocked him for so-called family reasons. You know what those are. So I actually think Vietnam, it's not a Doi Moi 1986. Vietnam came out of this not stronger because they still have the transition to do. And Trump could, he had a stroke. He's not terribly healthy and strong. He can't really work a whole day every day. And so I think that hurts. Of course, he has a lot of force of personality, but I think he's not a Xi Jinping either. That's for sure. The other thing I'd say, Huong, one thing that really pushes the leadership doesn't have total freedom on this stuff between the US and China, because every time China does something crazy like the oil rig in 2014, or Vietnam tried to pass the what do you call them? Exclusive economic zones isn't the right, no, the industrial parks law in 2018, the population really rose up and there were many riots where Chinese got hurt in both of these in Vietnam. I think the leadership has to keep its eyes backwards to see what the population wants. They don't comment on terribly many things with force, but on the Chinese, they're out there, 999 to nothing. But yeah, thanks guys. That was a great set of discussions, and I just had a few minor points to add.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your comments, Murray. Huong, do you want to reply to some of Hang's comments regarding how we categorize and place some of these new leaders that just came out in the 13th Party Congress?
Yes, and the book, I should have quoted your book too, Murray, because you did
no, it's okay. It's okay.
Effort. I actually hosted one of the first book tours of yours as well, so I am familiar with your arguments, and also I also don't agree with putting Vietnam before Singapore. Like I said, Singapore's partnership is much more developed. But I think what David had in mind, and that's what also one of the point that I raised, which is the challenge of perhaps over-promising what Vietnam and US current alignment might be, and that could be, that could reflect that overpromise. And perhaps Vietnam has been in recent years more vocal in diplomatic countering China than Singapore has been recently. Also in regard to the 5G and Huawei, also Singapore didn't opt for Huawei, but Vietnam was much earlier reactive to that. So in many cases, including South China Sea, because Vietnam has active dispute with China, whereas Singapore does not, and Singapore is much more diplomatic in many ways. And so I think in recent years that kind of optics and diplomatic rhetoric has changed, and that was quite perhaps a reason why David put Vietnam so forward. What was very, I would point to something that might not be directly related to any of your comments, but I think that was the moment when I kind of, what really, made me think a little bit, and put me in awe in a way, that when Secretary Pompeo, and I said that the relationship has become so much utilitarian. So I mentioned in the beginning that the two countries still needed some sort of reassurance that, you know, there's no harboring of ambitions and respecting Vietnam's system. And we've moved so fast from not only accepting Vietnam as a system, but Pompeo put Vietnam as an encouraged role model for North Korea. Of course, you know, that was very flattering for Vietnam, and the example of the Doi Moi reforms, how a communist country can succeed and can economically develop. But for a Secretary of State from US saying that the system that they once fought for decades now is a role model for another country, that was quite a moment for me, and that's why I thought the Trump's administration approach to Vietnam was very utilitarian, and of course Hanoi, you know, took advantage of that at the point it was useful for it, and again the security, like Murray said, the security developed very well. The trade, you know, there were some good gestures from Vietnam when signing up a number of trade deals, and when Trump was visiting Vietnam with Boeing and multi-million deals that Trump could claim that he's bringing back jobs to US and stuff like that. But the trade deficit is still, like I pointed out, is huge, and it's growing. And potentially that will spill over to Biden administration still, that Trump, that trade dispute and the currency manipulation status. Yeah, I agree that you know, Mekong has been also targeted by Trump's administration as a, you know, utilitarian, again, example of how bad China is, but hopefully will benefit Vietnam, because Vietnam has been, like you said, also, Murray also pointed out that Vietnam has been criticized for not taking enough of leadership in Mekong, even though it should. But I think, you know, there is that much pressure that it could sustain. South China Sea was one frontier that it had to, you know, take on in the regional context, the chairmanship, all other things. So I think it left Mekong a little bit less you know, attended to as it could. So hopefully with the support, but not only US, but, you know, Australians also started to pay attention to Mekong because of that. So yes, and the case of Myanmar, and I have pointed that out too, that it was quite disappointing for me to see that after the chairmanship, Vietnam just really, you know, didn't say much about Myanmar at all, especially that I've argued before that Vietnam is taking partial leadership in the region, especially in terms of security issues. With Myanmar, I think the initial argument was that, oh, Vietnam had been in the Party Congress, the 13th Party Congress, when the coup happened on the 1st of February. Then, you know, still the appointment of the cabinet had been ongoing until very recently. It was, yes, like you said, it was present on the military day, but so was India and other countries. So Vietnam is certainly not taking up that leadership, and I have pointed that out to the Vietnamese government. But also, I think, you know, Indonesia being the democratic leader around ASEAN is natural for its shuttle diplomacy. Philippines, I didn't see much of the effort, but for Singapore has a huge commercial interest in Myanmar, so it also does it for its own economic interest, because it's a big one, if not the biggest investor in the country. But equally, you know, underperforming our big democracies. India, the biggest democracy next door, has also been not visible at all. I'm not defending that, it's not, you know, but anyways, excuse Vietnam, but I think in general, the overall regional response to the Myanmar have been overwhelming, and unfortunately Vietnam has been quite among of them. But I do know that as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, in the recent weeks, Vietnam, I think, had been trying to facilitate at least be helpful in the Myanmar conversation, especially in terms of peacekeeping and other humanitarian assistance, certainly not blocking or not obstructing the consensus of the UN Security Council discussions about that. But yes, it would be more welcome if it stands up a little bit more on that issue. I'll go back and I'll tie your comments about the party and leadership to what Hang was raising as well. She raised as well. So before the party congress, I wrote a big piece arguing that this is really a turning point for Vietnamese party. It is a rare occasion that half of the Politburo had been in the age limit time, so half of them would not be eligible to re-election. Similarly to the secretariat, also half of the 14-member secretariat would face the age limit, and obviously there are always some age limit exception, but there would be only a few, not all of them would be eligible. So it was a rare moment where really it could rejuvenate. The party could rejuvenate, could have accepted a lot of new blood and all of that. But and it was a moment where in very, very special moment of going out of a global pandemic. Vietnam had been doing so well. The Prime Minister Nguyen Phu and his deputies had been really impressive in the COVID task force. They'd be coming out earlier, meaning that they could take care of the recovery phase earlier. There were a lot of, there was ongoing ambitions and goals of fourth industrial revolution. So Vietnam was in the position to really, after the party congress, to be modernized. That was my argument and that was my hope. But the 13th Party Congress didn't prove so much as we mentioned. Hang mentioned different groups, how they were labeled, whether they're red seekers, traditionalists, and whatnot. I was, in my earlier argument, talk about the technocrats, right? Like there is not much of, in my view, of strong ideological belonging or sense of a very strong sense of affinity. I'm this and I strongly believe in that or I'm that. And I think it's very fluid now. It's more also utilitarian. It's a lot of times very much politician for survival and continuity rather than anything else. But there was a group I would consider quite strong technocrats, like Nguyen Phu himself. I would call perhaps the Deputy Prime Minister Vũ Đức Đam another one of the case. Chao and a few others would be, very much traditionalist. But there is a lot in between that, that are quite fluid and can change. The technocrats became outnumbered as the results of the 13th Party Congress showed. And I was hoping really, like, if anyone can face the global pandemic challenge, that would be the technocrats. And it calls for that. It had everything in place. But, well, I don't think, they're not gone. They're still there, some of them. And I do think that now President Nguyen Phu will not be, quietly sitting there in the only representative role of president. I think he'll garner a lot of influence too. So yes, we don't have that very strong group as it used to be characterized before. But I did see that technocrat group emerging. Whether they can come back in the strength in the next Party Congress is still open up question. What I saw as a result of this Party Congress is extending the shelf life really of the traditionalists. It's not really. I don't think it's strong support for coming back to the purity and origins of Marxist-Leninist theories. I think we've passed that, but it's utilitarian. It's useful for continuing the line and the sake of stability and power. The regional representation was, yes, was an issue of this party congress. We didn't see enough or traditionally allocated sort of balance or, you know, equity in representation in the top positions of the Southerners. We didn't see even also women very well represented this time. It was just, yeah, just one, we have one minister of, I think, interior and domestic internal issues, a female, and one head of the state bank, but the rest are all male. And we don't have any female in the top 4 position in the 4 pillar, which is, you know, which we had before. So that was a bit disappointing. And to Cham's figure, I think some people said, well, he was not supposed to, at the previous party congress, he was a surprise, right? He came back at, you know, he was up against Nguyễn Tân Dũng. He won, his victory was a surprise to many. And he said back then he was already exceeding the age limit, and he said he will just stay for half of the term, 2.5. Surprisingly, he didn't, because you know, the then president had died in the office, and Chap not only stayed for the full term, he also became both secretary and the president at the same time. Now he's now for the 3rd time, which to some might be surprising, but also because he didn't secure this succession of the candidate he preferred. And as Murray said, it was probably, you know, he couldn't secure his legacy being forwarded, then therefore he stayed on to make sure that his legacy is being continued. But I don't think he's just a compromise figure. I think he's surprisingly strong. He was strong back then 5 years ago to outcompete a quite powerful rival, with Tân Dũng. And now not only him staying on for the 3rd term, but also, you know, if you look at the appointment of the Politburo and other key positions, the fact that they are outnumbered by so-called, you know, more traditionalist and more representing party interest rather than government interest, and more of public security portfolio and military, it shows that his support is strong. I mean, he's, you know, he will have his way, which meaning is the continuation of the anti-corruption campaign and the vision of the party and leadership that he has put in place. So I think, you know, so-called his action is strong. Of course, you know, it's a lot of compromises, a lot of deals, probably behind the doors that we don't fully comprehend. But the fact that he's not isolated, he's not in minority, he's not lonely out there, I don't think. Your question about Trump, yeah, and how the people think about Trump, whether they miss him or not. That was quite interesting that Vietnam took a while to congratulate the Biden victory, right? I think that was a lot of confusion what was going on in Vietnam. Vietnam didn't want to make a potential mistake. And I think it is true that in general people think that Trump is good because he's strong against China, is willing to call out China, and not everybody was very familiar with Biden's foreign policy, even though he's much more experienced in foreign policy. But in Vietnam, not everybody was that familiar. But I think, you know, even the survey that I quote in Southeast Asian surveys, there's a lot of optimism about you know, where Biden administration can go and with the U.S. representation. There are people who look actively at the U.S. foreign policy. They do ask questions: what does this, you know, foreign policy for middle class mean? Is it another way of saying America first as well? But I guess there are a number of signals that would say that, you know, the Anchorage meeting, the China issue, that the competition will continue. So we are sort of on the similar course that Trump has set in terms of US-China competition. And because of that, you know, Vietnam is useful, and you know, US is useful also to Vietnam because of that. But I guess and that comes to really, we still need to find out. I think Vietnamese are quite optimistic because the US ambassador, outgoing US ambassador to Vietnam, Daniel Kurtenberg, is being now nominated to be an assistant secretary for Asia and Pacific Affairs, which means that hopefully, you know, Southeast Asia and Vietnam will feature more prominently in the Biden agenda. I hope that sort of starts that answers most of your question, and happy to continue with further questions.
That was fascinating, so rich. And as somebody who studies Southeast Asia, but who is certainly not a Vietnamese expert, what always strikes me is how much of an outlier Vietnam is, at least with regard to perceptions of Trump and almost a desire to see the Sino-US rivalry, you know, continue as it is, which is something that so many of the other countries find very disconcerting. So it's just fascinating to hear all of this. We do have a question in the chat, but before I open it up, Huong, can I ask you about the CAATSA sanctions? These are the sanctions that the US has put in place, or Congress has, in order to punish Russia for Ukraine, countering American adversaries through trade sanctions. They cut off the ability of countries to buy US weapons and other things if they procure weapons from Russia. And Vietnam gets approximately 80% of its military equipment from Russia. So I'm curious how Vietnam views that. I know in the Indonesia case, that was a huge issue, and they actually didn't go ahead with some Russian purchases. What is the Vietnamese view?
I think for Vietnam was a little bit different because before it started off with it, you know, having sanction on the US weaponry, obviously because of the war legacy, which and the US sanction had only been lifted quite recently in 2014 and 16 and under Obama administration. So before that, it had no real access or affordability, to be also honest, of the US equipment. And with Russia, it has been a traditional main supplier. So it has been in place for decades. It's not going to change easily. I mean, Ukraine is also another one, and a number of others. Vietnam has been trying to diversify, but it's not going to be easy nor fast. I mean, you know, with the equipment comes the language, the training, and all the other skills that are related. And once you have have made the procurement, it's often about the upgrade and update rather than entirely new arsenal. So I think it will be, and Vietnam also has purchased different things from India. There are other things that Vietnam are looking at from Japan in terms of surveillance and maritime coast guards, and some of them are, special deals and as a goodwill that Japanese government has given to Vietnam. I think US also has tried to talk about that, and I think there has been some initiative about cost cutters as well. But I think, and Vietnam is interested in surveillance equipment, particularly in the maritime domain. There are, of course, talks even with Australia or European suppliers, but I think, like I said, it's one to have availability to purchase. Another is the budget and other things related to that. So it's going to be a long and process. Vietnam does want to also diversify from Russia because some of the Russia's equipment also are supplied to China, so there's that familiarity, which is not particularly useful when you're trying to think about that strategically. So this has been, to answer your question, that has been in place for a long time, so it's hard for US to punish it, like backtracking it.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask you, I know I said only one, but one more question, which is, could you talk a little bit more about the special relationship between the US and Vietnam? In the beginning of your talk, you made what I thought was a really interesting statement, if I understood it correctly, which was that overcoming the very divisive legacy of the Vietnam War era had forced the US and Vietnam to grapple with some hard issues so that they had developed a special relationship, and that stood in contrast to the transactionalism of the Trump administration. I'm curious as to what you mean. Do you mean relationships forged between the John McCains and the John Kerrys of the world who went back and, had kind of people-to-people relationships, or what exactly is the special relationship?
I think the Vietnam War, or American War, as they call it, also in Vietnam, is such a defining, chapter in each of history, whether Vietnam or US, and Hung would be in so much better position to talk about that. But it is defining. It's not just about current relationship, the trade volume, the diplomatic visit. It's also about defining who you are as a nation and who you were as a nation, where you come from. So it does affect the national psyche, and I can see it very strong still in America and in American public narrative in its key national monuments commemorating the fallen, and I think the same is in Vietnam, who we are. We've come up from this, decades of war and very difficult period, and we're kind of rebuilding and catching up with the rest of the world. It's still there, right? Even in the public policy, Vietnam had to really recently talking about catching up with the rest, because it didn't have the opportunity to develop economically when all the countries in the region had. And that's actually one of its key national security challenges, to catch up with others and not being lag behind. And every leader will tell you that Vietnam is a peace-seeking country because doesn't had too much war, and it's a country that suffers too much and it doesn't want to suffer. So it's a legacy still is seen visible almost every day, and that special historical experience that is painful for both sides, it makes this relationship very special, because any development in the relationship will take that in the context. Whereas Trump, of course, he didn't participate in the war. He didn't display the historical knowledge or sensitivity to the issue that much. Of course, the issues of addressing war legacies, the cleaning of the ordnance and stuff like that had been made mentions during those visits, but they were not central. Hopefully that will change, but before, it was the first thing to talk about, addressing the war legacy before we talk to other stuff. But under Trump administration visits, let's talk about South first, talk about cooperation, and then on the side, oh yeah, there is a Agent Orange cleaning and all of that. That's at least how I saw that. So it's anything, especially security relations, like it's that's why it took such a long time to build the trust, because not recently, like the leaders on both sides had remembered, some of them participated in the war, like you mentioned, John Kerry and whatnot. So it's very hard for them not to remember that while dealing with the present issues.
Okay, thank you. Now I have a much better understanding. So we do have a question in the chat from a Columbia alum, John Famola, who asks, are the pro-Chinese elements within the Vietnamese Communist Party motivated by shared communist ideology, as Truong Vu argues, or economic development interests, or both? And are there clear pro-China elements, or is that not the case?
I think both. It's hard to be pro-China these days. I think even the most traditionalists, I would say they would have hard time to be pro-China. I mean, it's always a question whether anyone can be pro X or Y country. The Vietnamese have very strong pro-Vietnam kind of policy outside. Having said that, though, I mean, Secretary Chong is, if anything, that's pro-ideology and pro kind of some sort of solidarity on two different fronts. One is ideology and the legacy of the Communist Party. And if anyone would be more inclined to utilize the party-to-party channels, it's probably, you know, people who have those more confidence in that channel and that solidarity. Not saying that it's absolute in any ways, and that has been tested many times. The party-to-party talk don't work when the crisis happened, and they didn't work in 2014 ORIC crisis. They're not very. They are often conducted, but they're not necessarily bringing much for Vietnamese interests. But I think some elements in the party still value that channel, that the fact that they have that channel, because if you don't have that, if China decided to shut off, then there's no communication channel. So that's still valued despite its limit. Another solidarity I think Vietnam, but also many developing countries have with China is that, developing success model, which a lot of developed countries or Western countries don't fully appreciate, because it's not about, the China model or, other, but just to see that from underdeveloped to you can become developed and become a strength in international affairs. I think it's quite impressive for many. Everyone wants to lift their countries from poverty. Everyone wants to do well and become an economic power. I think whether consciously explored or not, I think the Chinese economic strength is impressive, and not only for Vietnam, but most of countries in Southeast Asia, but also, like you say, would see in Africa or other countries as well. I think that's one of the Chinese attraction that the rest of the Western world are currently not as appreciative as other countries. So that is also a factor. But whether it is really, firm solidarity, I think it's being constantly tested. And I think even the most supportive of China in Vietnam would find it hard time now. And also, like Murray mentioned, it's also the nation that keep them in check, because the nationalism sentiment is quite strong.
Okay. We are just about out of time. Murray, Hang, Huang, anybody have any last comments?
I thought that Huong was going to take us when she mentioned Ambassador Crittenbrink, that it would bring actually more awareness to Vietnamese rap and Wowie as a way to foster that special relationship to promote this global shared culture in youth culture that we see in the United States. And there's K-pop too, but what we see in Vietnam, it just blows me away. My children are big fans, and that was just a masterstroke of a that rap that I had ever seen or heard. But no, I don't. This has been great, and I thank you so much, Huong, and I thank you so much, Murray. I mean, we've learned so much tonight, and to you, Anne Marie, for putting together this amazing event.
All right, well, I want to thank everybody for participating. Huong, your presentation was a real tour de force, and to have two experts like Hang and Murray here to comment and give their insights, I just thought as a non-Vietnamese expert, I learned so much. So I am extremely grateful to all of you for coming tonight. I want to thank everybody in the audience. I just want to let everybody know that we have 7 more weeks of this. Next week, we will have Evan Laksamana speaking on Indonesian policy towards the United States, and Don Emerson of Stanford. So if anybody is interested in that, it's Wednesday the 21st at 8 o'clock. There are registration links on Columbia, New York, Southeast Asia, and the Center for Foreign Policy Studies. Other than that, I really want to thank all of my guests tonight. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for attending. It has been a real distinct pleasure. Thank you.